Hello, everyone. I'm meteorologist Sean Sublitz, and welcome to Across the Sky, our national Lee Enterprises weather podcast. Lee Enterprises has print and digital news operations in 77 locations across the country, including at my home base in Richmond, Virginia. And as always, I'm joined by my meteorologist colleagues from across the country, Matt Hollander in Chicago, Kirsten Lang in Tulsa, and Joe Martucci in Atlantic City. Let's go around the horn and see how everyone is doing here this early part of August. Kirsten, how are things in Oklahoma?
Things are pretty good. I mean, it's still hot here, but we've had a couple of rain showers this morning, which helped a little bit. So I was able to get out and do a quick walk outside, which usually it can't happen when it's 104 degrees out. But Tulsa's doing good, just hot. I'm ready for the fall, I think.
Yeah, starting to hear that vibe from some other places as well. Matt, how are things there in the Midwest?
I tell you, the calendar has switched to August, but we're still getting severe storms that, and most recently the flooding that's been occurring in the Midwest. St. Louis just got hammered again. They had more flash flooding. Now, it wasn't as bad as what they saw, again, for people who are listening to this, it's going to be a little bit dated, but it was more flash flooding last night and not as bad as the extreme flash flooding that they had the week before, but just incredible. They had another pretty significant flash flooding event, and just the amount of heavy rain. It's been happening in Illinois too, central and southern Illinois. It always amazes me how long there can be heavy rain coming down in the same spots. Like, how can there be that much moisture in the atmosphere for it to rain for that long and create the scenes that you see? So that's been the big thing for me. It's just, more severe storms, and particularly the flooding that's happened over the last few weeks. I'm ready for some cooler weather and quieter weather as well.
Boxcars on a train. I remember learning about training in mesoscale meteorology many years ago, and all about it for sure. So now let's go to the shore. Mr. South Jersey, my man at the shore, Joe Martucci, running back and forth to Vegas, and he's going to run to Italy. Man, I wish I had this kind of time away, Joe. How are they does? But seriously, hardworking guy, honestly. How are things at the shore this week?
Well, I'll tell you what. So we each year I've been here. So this is the fifth time we've done our shore summer weekend weather report card, where I kind of subjectively grade what each weekend's been like at the shore. And we're recording this on the 4th of August. So last weekend, which was the last weekend in July, we went with our second A of the summer. And that actually brings us to a 3.4 GPA, which is tied with 2020 as the best summer in the 5 times we've done it. So we are on record pace. We'll see what happens the next couple of weeks. It does look like we're on B+ territory for this upcoming weekend. So that is some good news for us here. And yes, by the time everyone's listening to this on Monday, I will be somewhere probably in Newark Airport, ready to head across the pond to Malta and then Italy. It's actually for my grandma's belated 80th birthday, as well as my great aunt. It was actually supposed to happen in 2020 and then 21 and 22. So lots of family around. It'll be a really good time and a good way to wrap up summer here. But I'm not ready for the cooler weather. I'll have you know. Everybody said they're ready for the cooler weather. I am not there yet.
No, I'm
maybe
not
like
there
October
yet
20th.
Yeah, I'm not quite there yet either. So safe travels next week. And as they say, share pictures, Joe. Share pictures.
If you guys aren't ready for that cooler weather, you can come visit me and then get a real good taste of those triple digits. And then we'll revisit that issue.
Listen, that's fine with me. I mean, on a serious side, I have air conditioning, right? I mean, as long as you have air conditioning, you could be outside for periods of time. It's just anything between like 45 and 65 is like a waste in my mind.
Oh, that's another conversation for another time. But I kind of hear where you're coming from there, Mr. Martucci. I kind of do. But fall will be here sooner or later. And before we get to that, we have to get through August, which means we're starting to get into the core of the hurricane season. Heard a lot of rambling on social media about, the hurricane season hasn't been that bad yet. Well, it never is in June and July, but that's another whole thing. But with that in mind, and knowing that the season is going to be ratcheting up soon, I want to bring in our guest, Warren Madden. Warren leads the Air Force's Chief Aerial Recon Coordination of all hurricanes at NOAA's National Hurricane Center in Miami. Warren and I, admittedly, go back a little ways to our time at Penn State in the early 90s, but since then, he's done some amazing stuff. Warren was commissioned as a lieutenant in the Air Force in 1985, then worked on the air as a meteorologist at Dayton in the 90s before joining the hurricane hunters of the Air Force Reserve's 53rd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron in 1998. And before retiring as lieutenant colonel in 2012, Warren flew into some of the most historical hurricanes on record: Floyd, Ivan, Rita, and Wilma. So some stories are there to be sure. Warren, thanks for coming on to the podcast this afternoon.
Hey, great to be here. It's been a while since we tread the grounds of Happy Valley up in Pennsylvania. Glad to be back seeing you and being on the podcast.
Yes, it's wonderful. So I'm looking forward to some cool stories. Before we get to some of the specifics about being up in the sky and flying into a hurricane, talk about what got you interested in weather in the first place, because originally you had a computer science degree from MIT in the mid 80s. So why the change?
Well, the weather actually goes way back even further than that. I have loved the weather since I was, 4 or 5 years old. I grew up in the Boston area, and so of course we had our share of weather up there as well, mostly of the snow variety and et cetera. But what actually got me first interested in the weather were tornadoes. I had seen on the newspaper we got every day a picture of a house that was just ripped apart by a tornado in Texas, and that got me kind of intrigued that the wind could do that. And so I started doing research at the local library in weather, and I was hooked. I was the kid who was pointing out, "Ooh, look, mommy, a cirrus cloud. Ooh, look, mom, a cumulonimbus cloud." Drove my parents batty. And so I was on track to go into meteorology from a young age, and then I got to high school, and the computer bug bit me. And so screech detour, and off I went to get my degree in computer science. And that, of course, MIT was not by comparison to today's dollars, it not that expensive, but in those days, yeah, it was still expensive. So that meant Air Force ROTC scholarships. So that's how I ended up in the Air Force. And I started off doing computer science, and I realized that if I stayed in computer science in the Air Force, I was going to be told, you can go do contract management now, which didn't really appeal to me. So I said, I want to go back to weather. So I convinced the Air Force to send me to Penn State to get my second bachelor's degree. And that's where Sean and I met back in the early 90s. And then I went back to, I was out in Dayton, Ohio at Wright-Patterson, and doing consulting work for the Air Force and how their weapons and aircraft would be impacted by the weather. And through a very fortunate set of circumstances, right place, right time, right skills, I got the chance to start in local TV in Dayton. And after 3 years there, I went down to the Weather Channel. So I was on the Weather Channel full time from 1997 through 2004. And through that, again, right place, right time, right skills. That's what led to my invitation to join the Hurricane Hunters. And then from there went, when the Weather Channel changed directions a bit, and I realized that I'd better jump before I got pushed, I leveraged my computer experience and went to work at Lockheed writing software for the Hurricane Hunter aircraft. And then in 2014, when the opening, after retiring from flying, I missed the game. I missed being part of the hurricane hunting experience. And so when the opening came here at the Hurricane Center to be the coordinator for everything, I jumped at that chance and came down here and have been here ever since.
That's so exciting. So much cool stuff here over these last 20, 25 years for sure. Let's back up a little bit and get the conversation rolling here. A lot of us, understand that conceptually of why people are flying into hurricanes. But when we say people, this is largely Air Force. So talk about how this gets done originally. I mean, who's flying into hurricanes for operational purposes? Is it just the Air Force squadron out of Biloxi, or are there other operations doing it as well?
There are actually two primary organizations that we work with as far as going into the storm. One is, of course, the 53rd Weather Recon, my old squadron at Keesler, and they fly the venerable WC-130 aircraft, and we have 10 of those. And then our other primary flying squadron is NOAA's Aircraft Operations Center. They're based out of Lakeland, and they have two P-3 Orion aircraft that are kitted out as effectively airborne science labs. And then then they also have a Gulfstream G4 that doesn't fly into the storm, but it flies around the storm and out ahead of it, and releasing, a couple of dozen dropsons, instrument packages during the course of each flight in order to gain information about what the atmosphere is doing around and ahead of the storm. Because just like a cork floats in a river, a hurricane effectively floats in the rivers of air that are flowing around the earth at all times. And so knowing how those rivers are flowing has a definite impact upon knowing how the hurricane is going to move. And that, of course, is crucial information for the forecasters.
All right, so the call comes, or the assignment comes out that, Air Force in Biloxi, the reserve in Biloxi, needs to fly into a storm to do recon. There's obviously travel time to get to the storm. But once you get to the storm and start doing the actual data collection, how long is that process? You meet the storm and you start doing these passes. Walk through what's going on during that time for people.
A typical mission will last anywhere from between 6 to as long as 12 hours. And as you mentioned, there's transit time to and from the storm. We have a very large operational area. We'll fly storms from all the way east to the Leeward and Windward Islands. All our operational area covers all the way west to Hawaii. So needless to say, the planes can't reach there from Mississippi, all those areas. So we have several forward operating locations down in St. Croix if we need to pick up storms coming across from Africa. We'll actually go to Hawaii and fly storms that are approaching the Hawaiian Islands. But once we take off and we transit and we're ready to go into the storm, we do all of our prep work to make sure that we get a latest update. I'll send the plane a latest update on coordinates and motion and strength from the forecasters, so they have the latest information to work from. And then they'll descend. The plane descends down to the altitude that it's going to be working at. Now, for the weaker storms, if we're talking tropical depression or perhaps a weak tropical storm, the planes are actually very low. We can be down as low as 1,500 or even sometimes down to 1,000 feet above the surface of the water, crisscrossing the area. And let me tell you, when you look down from 1,000, 1,500 feet, there's not a lot of room between you and that ocean, and you're hundreds of miles of land. So that's when you're very glad that your plane is working properly. Now, as the storm gets stronger, of course, we're not going to be down that low because we don't want to deal with updrafts and downdrafts, that kind of scenario. So we gradually move up the altitude. So for mid-strength storms, again, stronger tropical storms will fly at 5,000 feet, 850 millibars. And then for once you start getting into hurricane territory, our standard operating altitude for the 53rd is 10,000 feet or 700 millibars. So that's one misconception that a lot of people have. They think, oh, you go over the top and drop into the eye. It's like, we're plowing right through at 10,000 feet. And, we go in, and the typical pattern we'll fly is effectively an X pattern. We'll come in, say, from the northwest, exit out to the southeast, and then go up to the northeast and come in. And a typical mission will cross the eye 4 times. So that means that we're going actually through the eye wall, that ring of intense thunderstorms around the eye 8 times during the course of the mission. And so much of the flight, and the typical leg lengths are about 120 miles from the center of the eye out to the corners. That's typically the radius that we'll fly around in. So when you're coming in from the corners for at least a decent amount of your run in, it can be a little bumpy and certainly rainy, but it's not that bad. And then we're really focusing on that eye wall penetration and getting into the eye. So we have our minimum crew on the C-130 is 5 people. There's the pilot and co-pilot, and then there's the navigator, and then there's the weather officer, which was the job that I held. And then we also have the load master, who's responsible for releasing all of the dropsons. And so, of course, it's very much a team effort, and everyone has their job to do as we try to maneuver safely into the center of the storm. So as we're driving in, of course, in the Northern Hemisphere, low pressure, which is what a hurricane is, rotates counterclockwise. So if we keep the wind off of our left wing, we know we're driving toward the center of low pressure. Now, of course, we do have to account for, that wind trying to push us off course. So you have to angle into the wind so you're traveling straight if you look at it as far as on the ground track. And depending upon the strength of the storm, that angle you have to it's called crabbing into the storm, into the wind. The angle that you have to crab increases as the wind speed increases. So the pilots are continually having to add or subtract to maintain that straight track. And then the winds are not constant. They're varying a lot. So as the weather officer on my instruments, I would be looking at, how the winds were blowing, and I would be acting. If you think back to, say, World War II, and if you ever seen a movie where you've got a bomber crew trying to make its way to target, you've got the bombardier calling out course corrections for the pilot to line up. That's kind of the role that I was playing. But instead of going for a target of a bomb attack, I'm trying to get to the center of the storm. So I'd be telling the pilot, turn left 20 degrees, okay, turn right 15 degrees, as we try to keep going on that path to the exact center of the storm. So that's my role, to kind of lead us into the center of the storm. The pilots are, of course, their role is flying the aircraft, which, as you might imagine, it can be a bit of a challenge in the middle of, say, a hurricane. And they're trying to respond quickly to my calls for course changes, while at the same time maintaining control. The navigator, he or she, is focused on the radar at that time, because I'll call out a course correction, say 20 degrees left. Well, the navigator is looking at the radar to determine if that's a safe course to take, or if that's heading us right to a big thunderstorm. And so they'll, say, if I say 20 degrees left, if it's a good course change, the navigator will say, okay, turn, 310 degrees. And then the pilots would execute that. Or the navigator might say, hold off, let us get a couple of miles before we make that turn. So here we are plowing through the eye, and it can get relatively bumpy. Now, sometimes, you'd be surprised. I've been through Cat 5 eye walls that had no worse turbulence than you'd get flying cross country in the middle of the winter. Because if you think about it, if you're flying from, say, LA back to New York in the middle of the winter at 38,000 feet or whatever, you're typically flying through the jet stream at some point. And the jet stream in the winter can be going at 150, 200 miles an hour. So anyone who's flown cross country in the winter has likely flown through Category 5 winds and not even realized it. Yeah, you get a few bumps, but not that bad. And by the way, my wife hates me when we do that, because we'll hit those bumps and I'll just look over and go, wee. And she's like, shut up, Warren, shut up. So, sometimes the big storms will get into a fairly steady state, and there'll be some bumps, but not too bad. Then there are the other times. There have been times where the plane has been shaking so violently that my eyeballs could not keep up with how my body was strapped in. Basically they were doing like the old cartoons, blah, 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 and I couldn't read my instruments for a good 20 or 30 seconds. Imagine a dog with a chew toy, just, shaking it all around. Now imagine you're the chew toy.
This is Chris Lay. I'm one of the editors on the show, and Warren's audio dropped out, but we got him back up, and he picks up right where he left off. So here you go.
When we last left our intrepid adventurers in the storm, they were being shaken like a chew toy. So yeah, I mean, it's at that point, we're not flying the aircraft. We're waiting for Mother Nature to give it back to us. And we're very fortunate. The C-130 is a very sturdy aircraft. I worked at Lockheed for 7 years at the plant that builds those 130s. So I've seen them in every phase of construction, and incredibly sturdy. They're the pickup trucks of the Air Force. And so very glad that we have something that sturdy. So then you'll go from, gradually the wind speeds are ramping up. And, I talked about the crab angle earlier. We fly in at about 180 knots, roughly 200 miles an hour. And that's, what we've determined is the safest speed to come in. And a big Category 5 hurricane, the winds are at 180 knots. And so we're actually, if we're trying to fly, say, straight east, our nose of our aircraft at that point is likely pointed all the way to the northeast, just to offset that wind trying to blow us off course. And so we come through the eye wall, and it can be, the rain is incredible, just slamming off of the aircraft. We can get some small hail. And then in the space of just a minute or so, everything starts quieting down as you start breaking out into the eye. And the winds will drop from 150, 180 miles an hour in the big storms down to 50, 40, 30. And I'm still calling out course corrections. And eventually, if we are really on it, I've walked it down all the way to 1 knot, 0 knots. And then the instruments will show the winds flipping from off the left wing. It'll be like, bink, off the right wing. and we've hit the center of the storm. So I'll call the navigator to mark the position. I'll tell the loadmaster to release the drop sonde, which we'll use to measure the actual central surface pressure. And then, once we confirm that the drop sonde is working properly, we head on outbound. And so typically we're only in the eye if we're doing a straight across for a couple of minutes. And then you have this wall of gray and black ahead of you, which is the outer eye wall, the other side eye wall. And so now you're going from winds of 20 or 30 knots. Within 30 seconds, you're back up to 150, 180 knots and back into the washing machine. And then gradually it tapers off as you make your way further out. And all the while we're bouncing through that outer eye wall, I'm trying to type on my keyboard as I'm trying to piece together the information to send to the Hurricane Center, my office here on satellite, to let the forecasters know what we found. So talk about your interesting work environment. Try typing when your plane's doing this. Not that easy. So that's one pass. And then typically we do a total of 4 passes during the course of the storm. And then that aircraft will head back for home. And depending upon how far the storm is from land, that will depend upon how frequently we're visiting it. When the storm's a reasonable amount of distance from land, we might send a plane in twice a day. And they might only stay out there for a few hours, 2 passes through, in part because it takes longer to get out to the storm, so there's less time and fuel to stay on station. As the storm starts getting closer, it'll still be 2 planes a day, but now they'll spend 6 hours in the storm environment. And then once the storm is within about 300 miles of land, we pretty much have a plane in there at all times and continually feeding information back to my office here at the Hurricane Center. And we're getting that information directly. We work directly across the hall from the forecasters. So there's a well-worn path in the carpet of us carrying information over to the forecasters. So these days now we're starting to enter the technological age and actually using shared Google Drive to put information out for them then. And one thing that's really changed in the past couple of years is the information that we're putting out is getting ingested more and more into the computer models. So that means what we're trying to do, many of the listeners have probably heard the term the spaghetti plots, where the different computer models we use just spread out like somebody took a bunch of spaghetti and went plop with it on the table. Well, one of the goals of getting our data into the computer models is to hopefully change that blap of spaghetti into more, basically they clump into straight lines, which it helps the forecasters as far as the track and the intensity forecast. So that's how the weather recon side of it works. Now, from the side of Airborne Operations Center, the P3s, they're doing the same thing crisscrossing through as we are, but they are more focused on the science aspects of it. So they'll have onboard scientists that are doing experiments, collecting data to try and figure out what makes these big storms tick, so that we can improve the theory of how storms work and improve the way forecast models figure out what the storms are going to do. So it's very much a cooperative effort. The information that the 53rd Weather Recon gathers is available to researchers. And then the NOAA aircraft, as they're doing their science, they're also collecting data on where the storm is, how strong it is, where it's moving, and we get that information to the forecasters. So it's an incredibly interesting subject that I really enjoyed doing. I miss flying. I only retired. I only left because I had to retire. I aged out. So I'm very glad that I'm still in the game and still being able to provide this very valuable service in the end, the end goal is protecting people's lives and property.
Warren, that's just amazing. It is truly amazing work. And I'm hoping one day if they decide they're still going to take media folks to do it, it's one of those hallmark or bucket list things that a meteorologist has on his or her career. We're going to take a little bit of a break, and then we'll come back and we'll fire a few more questions at you about some of the specific stories you have. So we'll be right back with Warren Madden from the Hurricane Hunters on the Across the Sky podcast. Welcome back to the Across the Sky podcast. I'm meteorologist Sean Sublett from the Richmond Times-Dispatch, part of Lee Enterprises. And we're with Warren Madden of the Hurricane Hunters, telling great stories about what it's like to fly in a hurricane. And he's done it several times. Matt, I know you had some specific questions for Warren, so why don't you go ahead next?
Yeah, Warren, that was a great overview of the general process of how it typically is with a storm. But my question for you is, what storm stands out to you as the most memorable? What has the best story? If you had to pick your most intense storm, your scariest moment with the hurricane hunters, what storm was it and what made it so intense, so scary, so memorable?
I've been fortunate enough to fly into everything from small depressions all the way up to some big monster Cat 5s. But I think, let me tell the story of the worst beating I ever took. And this actually ties into September 11th. I was supposed to fly into a tropical depression in the Gulf of Mexico on the morning of September 11th. And myself and the crew were preparing, and we heard that the first tower had been struck. We saw the second tower get hit. And of course, at that point, the airspace was shut down and our mission was canceled. And for the next several days, I was basically trapped at Keesler Air Force Base because all of a sudden there were guards everywhere. You had to have guards just to go in and out of the visiting officers' quarters that I was staying in. So a couple of days pass, and now the system is getting closer to land, getting closer to the west coast of Florida. So we get a dispensation, we get a special authorization to fly a mission out into this storm. So we take off from Keesler and we're headed down. And usually when you're flying in the areas close to the US coast, especially in the Gulf, you're on the usual air traffic control channels and you're hearing all of the chatter back and forth between the airliners and Miami Center, Jacksonville Center, Houston Center. Dead quiet on the radio. Spookiest sound I ever didn't hear, except every so often we'd hear these little garbled blurbs of something coming across the frequency. And it took a little while for it to hit me what it was. It was the F-15s and F-16s that were flying air combat patrol up high. And the reason we were only hearing little glabs and globs was they were on their frequency hopping encrypted radios. So as they bounced across our frequency, we'd hear that little bit of encryption as it went on. So now by this time, we're getting somewhat close to the west coast of Florida to where we're going to be flying the storm. And what's in Tampa but the head of U.S. Central Command, which is responsible for, the area in the Middle East. And so I get on the intercom and I'm like, pilot, weather, we do have all of our identification friend and foe codes loaded, right? And he confirmed as such, because the last thing I wanted to have happen is be out there trying to fly a hurricane, or at this time a tropical storm, and to have an F-15 or F-16 pilot see a moving target down low off the coast of Tampa and decide it was better to act first and ask questions later. So fortunately that didn't happen, but that was just the start of the evening. This was a nighttime mission. I always seem to get a lot of nighttime missions. So we made our first pass into what was a strengthening tropical storm. Gabrielle, I think was the name. And we came in from the northwest rather, since we were coming down from Mississippi, went through the center of the storm and went out to the southwest, heading down in the general region of Key West. And it was obviously clearly a tropical storm. It was trying to get stronger. And then we made the run up the Florida west coast and we turned to come inbound from the northeast. So we're making the run in, and I'm expecting that the center is going to be, because we had located where the center was on the first pass. So I expect, okay, given motion, this is where I expect it to be. So about 25 miles before we were going to get where the center I thought was going to be, there was this line of, thunderstorms, nothing uncommon, didn't look like that bad on radar. And so we were just, heading straight through, and all of a sudden, and we're flying, because it wasn't that strong a storm at that time, we were flying at 5,000 feet. Well, remember I was saying earlier about the chew toy? This was a chew toy moment. We got slammed. The bottom dropped out, and I was strapped in, fortunately, but if I hadn't been, it would have been ceiling time. We lost a couple of thousand feet and then immediately got slammed upwards. We did negative G's and then positive, a couple of G's positive. So, roller coaster without the rails, basically. And this was definitely one of those times where my eyes were rattling around in my head so much that I couldn't read my instruments. And so you remember earlier I was saying we fly with the winds off the left wing, and then we know when they go to the right wing, we pass through the center of the storm. By the time the turbulence settled down and I could read my instruments again, I looked down at them, winds were off the right wing. The center had jumped. Instead of being 25 miles out in further to the west, a new center was trying to form right where we just gone through. Oh boy. So I get on the intercom and it's like, pilot weather, can we go back there? Because that's where the new center is. Now, very experienced crew, and this was early in my career, mind you. This was only a year or two after I'd become fully qualified as a weather officer. So I'm here, of course, second guessing myself, saying, am I doing everything right? And so we turn around, we go through, and we get slammed again, and the same thing happens. By the time I can read my instruments, we pass through the center again. So it's like, okay, we got out into the clear again, and we talked about a different strategy. So first things first, we climbed up to 10,000 feet. So we had some more room beneath us. Then instead of just driving straight through, I worked with the navigator and we started weaving our way, trying to sneak up on that new center, as it were, and avoid as much as possible the thunderstorms that were rattling us. And eventually on the third try, we finally got it. We finally got a center. It had dropped several millibars in pressure from where I'd found the first center. And you could see that line of thunderstorms that we'd gone through the first couple of times. You could see it now curling as it was trying to coalesce into an eye wall. So we finished the mission, and ironically, the storm ran out of time. It made landfall on the Florida coast north of Tampa as a strong tropical storm, never quite getting to hurricane status. So I like to say that the worst bleep kicking I got in terms of my flights in the hurricanes wasn't even a hurricane. It was a tropical storm that was trying to become a hurricane and just didn't have time to do so. But it really did rock us.
Yeah, I would not have guessed that. You always think it's got to be a Cat 5. It's got to be the most memorable one, but a tropical storm. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like it's the thunderstorms that you really have to watch out for, even more so than the eye wall. The thunderstorms that you encounter, maybe not necessarily in the eye wall, are the biggest threat, which of course is why we have flight delays across the country, because those planes are trying to avoid the thunderstorm. So I guess that's the biggest thing you have to watch out for.
Thunderstorms, any aircraft has to watch out for them. In our flight manual for the WC-130, it actually, for all 130s, it says you should avoid thunderstorms by at least 25 nautical miles. And then there's a sub-paragraph to that section that says, except WC-130J Hurricane Hunter missions on a tasked mission. So if we're not flying on the tasked mission, we have to avoid thunderstorms as well. But we are able to go in the area when we're flying a tasked mission because there's no way to avoid it. But yeah, thunderstorms are nothing to mess around with an aircraft. Far too many people have lost their lives flying the storms thinking, oh, it won't be that bad, and not realizing till too late, yes, it will be that bad.
And that's the end of part 1 of our visit with Warren Madden, talking about his experience flying into hurricanes as part of the Air Force Reserve Hurricane Hunters. Next week, we'll have part 2, where Warren will talk about his experience of flying into Hurricane Rita at night in 2005, and how the advances in communications have allowed data to get back to shore to make the forecast better, faster. Thanks for joining us this week on Across the Sky. For Kirsten Lang in Tulsa, Matt Holliner in Chicago, and Joe Martucci in Atlantic City, I'm Sean Sublett from the Richmond, Virginia Times-Dispatch, and we'll talk to you next week.